presentation now. Can you
Yes, that's
confirm, Alex?
perfect. That's perfect,
Okay.
Vincent.
So I'm just going to. Okay, good morning, everyone. First time I'm doing this from home, so I hope everything will be okay. As Alex said, my name is Vincent, and I'm a senior lecturer at King's College London. So I'm going to spend about 15 minutes telling you about what we do and what the engineers do when we work with the brains, and then I'll be answering your questions. So first I'm going to tell you a bit about me before talking about my work, about my journey, my educational journey. So in my work, I do research and I teach at King's College London, which is one of the big universities, in London. So I spend about half my time on educational matters and half my time in doing research. And what me and my colleagues are trying to do is we're really trying to understand how the brain works, how it goes wrong, and what we can do when things go wrong with the brain, how we can help. So in terms of what I studied when I was in university, I studied in France. I started by studying general engineering. So we just had all the engineering together. So you're doing chemical engineering, you were doing civil engineering, mechanical engineering, everything together for the first year or two, and then specialized. At that time, I decided I was in computer engineering. Didn't really like it because the way it was taught then, I'm talking about 25 years ago, was really theoretical. So I wanted to do something a lot more applied. So I switched to biomedical engineering, which is the engineering branch where we deal with the medical and the biomedical biosciences. This I really enjoyed. And then after a while, you have to further specialize. In my case, I guess I had to choose a body part to specialize in. And I really was been really interested in the brain. So I chose to specialize in brain engineering, if you want, brain-related engineering. I'm European. I mean, these days it's important, though, just to give you a quick run through. My parents are from Italian origins. I'm born in France, grew up where France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany meet. That's where I grew up, and I studied in various places in France. Then I used the Erasmus and the Leonardo scheme from the EU to travel when I was doing my studies, to travel abroad. So I ended up studying in Iceland for a while, and then I came to the UK about 24 years ago now, and I've stayed there. And I guess to complete the loop, my relation and my children who are born here, they're French, Russian, and English. I mean, they're not sure what they are. But one thing is sure, we're not going anywhere, we're staying here. So as I said at the beginning, I work, and as Alex said, I work at King's College London. So it's a big university and there's different faculties of universities. For example, there's arts and humanities. So I work on the health school of university, and more precisely in one faculty, the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, Science. And what we do, it's all in the name. We study, psychiatry, psychology, and neuroscience. So we all work together. Specialize in is really mental health, trying to understand mental health and work in mental health. I mean, usually I'm of psychiatry, psychology, neuroscience, but of course today, like you, I'm at home in South London in a place called Catford. Some of you may know. So I'm an engineer. That's what I did by training. But these days, myself and my colleagues, I guess we all call ourselves neuroscientists, which I'm not going to talk about much today. I mean, these days articulates around what happens in the brain when you're learning new skills. So I think some of the big research projects I'm involved are all tapping into understanding how the brain changes when we're learning. So neuroscience is a really big field. So we study the brain, but we can study the brain at lots of different levels. So some of my colleagues are studying the brains, looking at brain cells. So here, what you see moving on your screens are neurons. They're on a dish. So they're still moving, and you can see that connect to each other. They're still alive, trying to connect to each other. So, a large part of neuroscience, I'm on the neuroscience side of my faculty. Part involves working with brain cells, but this is not what I'm doing. So I'm not looking at cells in my work. other colleagues work with brains. So this is somebody at work, Claire, who's actually here looking at a real brain. She's manipulating real brain that people have donated. So we have at King's College London and in other universities, we have brain banks when people have kindly donated their brain after they passed away. So, and we're using the brains for research and to understand the diseases they might have had when they were still alive. But I'm not doing this. I'm not touching or looking at real brain. I'm looking at brain images. And the way I do it, so my side of neuroscience is system neuroscience. We look at big neuroscience. We use big machines. We use various machines to look at the brain, the live brain. So this is a picture of an MRI scanner, which is what most of us are using in our research in the building where I work. So I'm in the neuroimaging department, and most of the research we do involves using MRI scanners like this one. So how it works doesn't really matter for today. It's just a big magnet, as the sign on the door says. So you have to be really careful when you go in the room not to have anything metallic, but you just go in the magnet and we take pictures of your brain. And what we produce, we end up with images which are a bit like made up of Legos. So we can take pictures of your brain made up of all these different pieces, and together they make a picture. And then we can analyze this data to try to understand what's going on in the brain. So roughly, the type of images we do with these machines is split between anatomical imaging, when we study brain anatomy, and we study brain function. So in terms of brain anatomy, there's loads of different things you can do. With the same machine, you can run the machine in different ways to produce different kind of images to do different things. So the one you see on the top left here, this is the kind of images that the doctors will be using. If you go to the hospital to have an MRI scan, they would do these kind of pictures to try to see what's wrong with your brain if you have to go to see not to the hospital. In our case, for research, we would be using the same anatomical imaging to see what or where are the brain differences between different, for example, patient populations, or between different ages, what's happening in your brain when you grow up. We would try to find out where bits of your brain are still growing or where things can go wrong. So I'm going to try to stop this one at some point. So this here, we're looking at the brain. We going up in the brain. So this is the top of the brain, and now we're going at the bottom of the brain. This is the spine. I hope you can see my mouse. This is the spine and spinal cord in the middle. There's one image I really like, which is about here. This one I really like. You can see, so we can see some of the brain here. We can see the eyes. So it looks like a real weird alien thing. So we're looking at the brain from the top, like the camera, if you want, is at the top. You can see the eyes at the front. You can see the nose. So that's the cartilage of the nose. And here, I don't know how it looks on your screen, but you can see a little squirrely thing here, which is the cochlea in your ears. So I really like this one. So using the same machine, but if you want programming it in a different way, we can take different kind of pictures. So the one you see here on the right, this is a brain. So I'm just taking my plastic brain. This is a brain who's turning on the side like this. And what we're looking at blood vessels and blood arteries. So we're looking at the blood in the brain. This is used a lot in the clinic, for example, if it's called an angiogram for angiography, and if a suspected stroke, for example, which may be a blockage in your brain, the doctors, basically the specialist, the neurologist or the neuroradiologist, they would look at this picture and they would see immediately, well, there's something missing. There should be another branch somewhere, which could indicate that there's a blockage in the brain. The two you see at the bottom, it's a different technique, again, done using an MRI scanner, which is called diffusion tensor imaging, which is tractography. Here, what the spaghetti mesh you see, we're mapping the white matter fibers in the brain. So you've got your brain cell. If you remember the brain cells from a couple of minutes ago, we're trying to connect it. So these neurons, there's the body of the neuron, and then they're just attaching to each other. They're just connected to each other. They're using something called, it's the white matter of the brain. So the gray matter is the neurons, the body of the neurons, and the white matter of the brain, it's all the connections, physical connections between the neurons. And using this technique, we're trying to map some of these connections in the brain, and you can see some of these connections. So of course the brain is not colorful like this. The colors indicate the direction of the fibers in the brain, the direction of the connections. If you look at the one on the right, you would have the the green fibers going back to front in the brain. you would have the blue fibers up and down and the reddish purple fiber going out of the screen. So this is just to help us see the direction. And again, this could be used for research when we would be looking at what's different in the brain, in the connections between different brain regions, between different patient populations or different ages. And the doctors would be using this in case of brain disorders to try to understand what's going on in the brain. For example, if there's a tumor growing, to see where the tumor would have pushed the connections in the brain to prepare for surgery, for example. So this was about brain anatomy. Another thing we do a lot, and most of my research has been on brain function. So we're using the same scanner, the same MRI scanner, to look at brain function. So of course, you're still alive. You're just lying down in the MRI scanner. You do some experiment, and whilst you do the experiment, like this is just a slide from one experiment, which is called a mental rotation task. So you'd be presenting. So you'd be lying in the scanner. You would have a joystick or button boxes, and you see this on the screen, and you would have to decide if the picture on the right is the same as the picture on the left rotated. Can you rotate it in your head? Can you move it? Can you reach this position by mentally rotating this one, or is it impossible? So you'd have to decide if it's the same or if it's a different picture. And whilst you do this in the scanner, we take pictures of your brain when you're thinking. So it's a bit like an old style film. Every second, we take a picture of your brain activity. So we know what you're doing every second. We take a picture. We know what your brain is doing. We know what button you're pushing. We know what's on the screen. And then by putting all this data together and analyzing the data using mathematics and statistics, we end up with these kind of pictures. So here we're looking at if the camera is at the back. So we're looking at somebody from the back. You can see ears here from the left and right. And this is the back of the brain, which is where your visual cortex, the bit of your brain that deals with vision, is at the back. So most of the back of your brain actually deals with vision. And by analyzing all this data, we can then find out which part of your brain are being involved in doing different tasks. And then again, we would compare what's happening in the brain of healthy people and in the brains of people with various disorders to try to understand what the differences are. So we usually bring all the data together. We would look at differences in brain anatomy, in brain function, and something I haven't mentioned, chemistry as well sometimes, to try to understand, to get an idea from lots of different angles. So that's great. That's what we do. But today we're talking about engineers. So what do engineers do when working in neuroimaging? So neuroimaging is really, really multidisciplinary. So in the building where I work, it's called the Center for Neuroimaging Sciences at King's College London. We've got people who've studied everything. So we have clinicians, so we would have psychiatrists, neurologists, clinical psychologists, we have nurses, we have doctors, and then we have engineers, we have physicists, we have psychologists. I mean, we all work together on the same projects. When we do these imaging project, it's a big team of people from loads of different professions working together. Of course, everybody's got their own specialism, but slowly over the years, you start to really understand what everybody else is doing in the team, and this makes better work. But the engineers can be found in different places. So of course, anything to do with hardware, building the equipment. Of course, we haven't built our MRI scanners, we bought them, but they're being built by engineers, by physicists. And our engineers are building the equipment we need to go in the scanner as well. So we can either buy it if we need some joystick or some button boxes, we can either buy them or build them. And the other side, of course, there's the hardware. So there's the thing when you're building, and there's the software, all the computer programming to analyze the data or to make the scanner work, for example. There's this program that can buy engineers, amongst others. So these are just some pictures of equipment which some of our engineers in our team have built. So if I start from the top left, so these are some old button boxes and joysticks. Now we have 3D printers, so it's much easier to build equipment when we need it. So these were not 3D printed. These were done before we started using 3D printers. The one you can see on the bottom left, this is a great one. It's a repurposed recycling box, as you can see. And this was to do an experiment involving smelling. So you can, I don't know if you can see, and you probably can't see very well, but in this box, there's lots of different bottles with different smells, with lots of tubes coming out. And the idea is you would be lying in the MRI scanner and you would be smelling different smells, some pleasant smells, some unpleasant smells. And then we would be acquiring pictures of your brain as you do this. And then we try to find out, what's happening in your brain when you're smelling all these different things. The two you see on your right are related. They're from studies looking at osteoarthritis, which is what some of my colleagues are studying pain. So it's about pain. It's when you have pain in your joints. So a lot of your grandparents or great-grandparents may have arthritis and osteoarthritis. So it's a type of pain that doesn't really go away. So we're trying to really understand this pain better. So these are two different bits of equipment which have been built for that. The first one is a device where I would just push on the joints to inflict a bit of pain in a controlled way, of course, and the people have agreed to it, and the ethics committee have agreed to it. But so whilst we applying the pain, we would scan the brain to try to understand what's happening. And the one at the bottom is the more interesting. This is a way to simulate turning a key. So you can add more or less resistance to this to make it harder to turn the key. And of course, if you have pain in your joint, turning the key is really painful. And it's something we do every day. Just opening a door, any kind of movement like this would be painful. So we're using this to simulate more realistic situation. And interestingly, of course, in this situation, people already start experiencing pain before they physically do it because they know the pain is coming. So we have students and staff studying pain using this amongst other devices. So this is the type of equipment people can build. The other thing that the engineers are doing and that my colleagues are doing, they are actually writing the code, the software programs to run all the experiments. When you are as a volunteer or as a patient, you come in the MRI scanner to do an experiment. So you are doing the experiment. Somebody has to program these experiments. So the one moving on the top left, it's an experiment, so it's some sort of virtual reality experiment. The idea of it is a memory experiment. You would be dropped somewhere in this landscape. So you're in the middle, you'll be dropped on a platform. You have to learn where you are by looking around you, looking at which buildings was in front of you or to the left of you. And then later on, you would be dropped in the same landscape in a different position, and you have to go back to where you were before. So you have to remember where you were looking around you. So this is a human version of a really famous animal experiment. So the one which just started on the right here, it's a completely different experiment. This is something where you have a joystick and you would have some instructions. You have to follow the numbers in order, or in reverse order, to skip some numbers or go one number, one letter. I mean, you would have some instruction, and with a joystick, you have to follow these instructions, which could seem easy for you, but it would be much harder for somebody who has some problems movement disorders, or somebody who has cognitive problem. They can't really understand what's asked of them. They can do, for example, they can go backward, but they can go forward, but they can't go backward or something like this. So that's another type of experiment. The one you see to the bottom left is again something completely different. This is something called neuromarketing experiment, where we are looking. So here you have an eye tracker. So we're looking at any time where we see where your eyes are looking, which is the cross here. So it was filmed in a supermarket, and the idea is to see what's happening in your brain when you're choosing what products to buy, for example. So you see now you have different prices, and we would be, of course, at the same time as you're looking at this, we scan your brain, we see what's happening in your brain. And the one which is just started, bottom right, it's something from one of the clinical trial, one of the big research projects I'm involved with right now, which is it's a study of neurofeedback. So the idea of this one is you play a computer game with your brain. So there's no controllers. You're just lying in a scanner, and with your brain, you're controlling this character, making him go. And by doing this, we are targeting a specific part of your brain, specific brain region, and we're training you to increase or decrease, depending on what the experiment is. In this case, it's increased brain activity in this specific region of the brain by playing the game. And the idea that if you can increase brain activity in this region, if you learn to do it on your own and demand, then this would have some beneficial effects later on. So that's it, basically. So this was my 15-20 minutes presentation about what we do when we do brain imaging and what the engineers do. And now I'm just going to take your questions.
Thank you so much for that, Vincent. So
Right.
interesting. I'm sure you've already inspired so many young engineers. What I'll ask them, like you said
Get
then.
my credits. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. What you said then? Yes, so we'll ask everyone to go into the Q&A section. It should be at the bottom of your screen. And if you could type in your questions for Vincent there, and then me and Jess can then read them out for Vincent. So it might just take a while for some questions to come in.
No
So we'll
problem.
just wait there for a second.
If you don't have any questions, I can carry on talking forever.
Yeah, we had an interview the other day with Sarah Haslam. We had lots and lots of questions flying through. I think we got through about 45. I think we got through Vincent. So there was a lot of really good questions from the young engineers. One that I've got to start off with for you. If you were doing kind of the Leaders Award, what do you think you would invent? What would your idea be, do you think?
Oh, that's a hard question. You should have asked me before to prepare. I don't know. Well, these days, because of the situation now, it would be to invent something to help people stuck at home for loneliness, people who are just stuck and maybe a bit bored at home. Invent new ways for people to connect and talk and do things together, remotely, but together. Maybe something creative that they can do together.
Yeah, fantastic. Really good idea. We've got some coming through, Vincent. So we've got some on Zoom and we've got some coming through. If you're on YouTube, if you could type them in on the comment section as well. The first question we've got is how did you get these videos and photos?
Well, that's a whole different talk, I guess, to
Yeah.
explain to you how the MRI scanner works. So maybe if you don't mind, anonymous attendee number one, I'm going to skip this one because it would be hard to explain. But there's lots of information. If you go on YouTube, for example, and you just check how an MRI scanner works, you would have a lot of like small clips on YouTube explaining you how it works.
Another one as well. So what got you interested in engineering?
Always, when I was a child, I was always interested in science in general. I knew I wanted to be a scientist, and I didn't know what type of scientist, I guess. I guess engineer is something I fell into naturally when in school, I guess. Because I was just doing, maths and physics and biology, and I just, naturally then just gravitated towards engineering. But I certainly knew I wanted to be a scientist.
I'll just
so
pass.
should I just read the next question?
I'll just pass over to Jess because I'm not sure if some are coming through onto YouTube.
Yeah, I've got a couple here. So first one is, what is your current research project about?
I mean, I'm working on lots of different research projects, but I guess the two biggest one, it would be the game I'm showing you, this neurofeedback, which is a project. It's a clinical trial, so we're evaluating this game. It's neurofeedback, so we're evaluating this game as a potential new treatment for ADHD. So that's a big 5-year project we're doing. The other big project I'm doing is trying to understand the neuroscience of entrepreneurship. So we're trying to understand what are the brains of entrepreneurs different, if you're successful or not, doesn't matter. We're looking at entrepreneurial thinking. Is this something different in the brain? And then if there is something different, can we then design new educational program to foster this further? So these are the two big projects, but I'm involved in lots of other projects. But I mean, mostly these two projects these days. I can answer questions from Lola Ray online, I guess, on Zoom. My mom wants to know if brain training activities on app actually work. So we're talking about brain training in general. So that's a really interesting question. It's a really debated question. I think the consensus, at least amongst my colleagues, and it could be different if you go somewhere else, is that they work in the sense that you become really good at doing one specific thing, the thing you're being trained onto. So if you are, for example, using an app to train your memory, you're becoming really good at these specific types of memory that the app is training you into, but it doesn't really translate to anything else. You don't just develop your cognitive activities or abilities in general. You're becoming really good at whatever you're training, which is slightly different from what these apps usually claim. Another question on Zoom. What is the biggest project you've ever done? I mean, it's really hard to know because you move from one project to another. Certainly, these, I guess the ADHD project, Professor called Katia Rubia, Professor Katia Rubia, I've been working with her for 15 years. So I've been involved in a lot of research. I would say probably this one is one of the biggest stream of research I've been involved with. Otherwise, the biggest project, I guess, as one project would probably have been my PhD, because I was doing this when I was doing my PhD. I was doing it part-time, and it was 6 years. So this is certainly the biggest project. And my PhD was actually software based at the time, writing software to make the analysis, to make this neurofeedback possible, to analyze, to make it possible to analyze data really, really quickly on the scanner. From Lollery, actual evidence for personalities. Well, some of my colleagues are studying these disorders. So it's not like in the movies or in the books, but certainly in the brain, it's brain disorder. And I probably wouldn't want to go too far because I'm not a doctor and I'm not working in that field. So rather than say something wrong, all I can say is that it's certainly something we are studying, and there's certainly evidence disorders in the brain that could explain what split personality is.
Sorry, Vincent. I think
Jess more Zoom or Facebook.
I think Jess has got a few more from YouTube.
Yep.
I do indeed. So another one here. What do you hope to achieve with your research? So what's the end goal?
Mm-hmm. I guess one of the reasons why already when I was a student, I moved to more biomedical research or computer, not research, like biomedical engineering rather than computer engineering, is I felt I wanted to do something more applied and something more useful, directly useful by working in the medical domain. So I guess what I would say is most of us want, the aim of our research is to try to make ultimately patients better, to try to understand brain disorders in our case, to understand brain diseases better, and hopefully try to find evaluating new treatments. So for benefits for patients. I've got one on Zoom. What would you say are the most important GCSEs needed to get into this line of work? I mean, as said, there's a lot of people we work in big teams. There's lots of different specialties. So anything scientific will do, to be honest, or clinical. But more precisely for engineering, I guess. I mean, you have to do some maths. There's no way around that. Maths, physics, technology subjects. But you don't have to be the best. I mean, I wasn't the best. It's good. I'm still doing it and I'm enjoying it. So the important thing is just to try and carry on and find something you like, find a combination of GCSEs you like. But for engineering in general, certainly you cannot escape maths and physics.
We've just got one in the chat. It's just popped up into the chat section, Vincent. So it's from Andrea. It says, have you ever been in the MRI scanner and what is it like?
Yes, I've been in the MRI scanner. I think all of us go in the MRI scanner several times. I've been several times. Some of my colleagues, physicists, they go like every week. So it's not great, I have to admit. It's quite claustrophobic. It's quite cold in the room because of the way the scanner needs to be cooled down. It's quite cold. Right now, it still is quite noisy, really noisy. So the sound of an MRI scanner, usually when you go in the scanner, you have earplugs plus some big ear pads, because the sound of a scanner is as loud as being next to a jet engine or in the street next to a jackhammer. So we really need to protect your ears. But this is now, things are changing. So right now in my building, we have several PhD students who are working on making the scanning completely quiet, so there wouldn't be any sound anymore, just like a buzzing sound, that's all, just like a mosquito, I think, as my head of department always says. Mosquito sound, so that's already there, so it's already working. And the next big thing is, if you remember the picture at the beginning, we're using these big cubes, which is these MRI scanners, which you can find in every hospital. So we're using these to do research, which is a bit of a waste, because all we're interested in is the brain. We're not really interested in the whole body. So now there's a new generation of scanners, and then luckily we're going to get the first commercial one installed in Europe, maybe in the world, I'm not sure, at least in Europe, before, well, it was supposed to be before the end of the year, I don't know when now, head only, a smaller version of an MRI scanner where you just put your head in. So this will be a lot more comfortable, and we can do a lot more experiments. So it'll be quiet, hopefully, silent, and much smaller. So we can do a lot more experimenting. That's the exciting thing. The technology is changing all the time.
We've got one from Lewis, Vincent. So how long does it take to do a brain scan?
It depends on what you're doing. So for example, these images I was showing you before, the typical scans when you go to hospital to have an MRI scan, this picture of your brain that the doctors are using to see if there's something wrong, they take about a couple of minutes each to do a whole brain volume. To do the whole brain is a couple of minutes. Usually when you go to the hospital to have a scan, it's about 20 minutes, half an hour, because they do different scans. And of course you have to get in and get out of the scanner. When we do research, so if Lewis was to come to us to do some research, you would usually spend 1 hour in the scanner. But then again, it's 10-15 minutes to go in and out of the scanner. There's about 45 minutes of scanning. We would spend about 15-20 minutes acquiring anatomical images of your brain. We always do that. And then the rest of the time could be spent doing experiments, 4 or 5 different experiments. I mean, again, it depends on the length of the experiments, but it's usually a couple of minutes to do scans. And when we look at your brain activity, again, it's about, the experiment lasts between 5 and 10 minutes, sometimes longer, but usually 5 and 10 minutes. I can take another one from Zoom, maybe from Lola. Is everyone's brain the same, or have you found something weird or different? So I'm not a doctor, so except if it's really obvious, I wouldn't see really if something's different. But of course, everybody's brain is different, and everybody's brain, and not just that, but in people's brain, there's a lot of what we call differential anatomy. There's a lot of, some parts of the brain are so different that there's like, for example, one group of people will have like too little, like say, if I bring my brain, if you take like, this kind of structure there, you like more, a group of people will have 3 different bumps, another group will have 1 bump, another group will have 2 bumps, and they're all perfectly fine, perfectly healthy. It's just that the brains are different in general. So when we are analyzing the data, because we want to compare everybody's brain, what we need to do is we need to map everybody's brain onto the same template, like a balloon that we warp. We just punch it and move it to fit into a template so that we can compare brains. But everybody's brain is different.
I think we've just got some more from YouTube.
Yep, I've got one here. How can you stimulate and make the brain do what you need by just having people look at the game only?
Oh, that's a good question. So there's choice there. So you either give instructions, because we know what part of the brain we want you to, for example, increase. We want to increase the activity of a specific part of the brain. We know from all the research that we've done and people have done, we know what kind of experiments would usually engage this brain activity, what kind of thoughts would engage this brain activity. So we can either guide our research participants or our patients by giving them some strategies. We can say, well, try to think about something emotional, or try to think about the last time you had a really nice holiday or something like this. So you can guide them towards something that would trigger this specific brain activity, or you don't at all. And what happens is it doesn't work as soon as you start. So you're in the scanner, the person stays at the bottom of the screen, moves, and then suddenly you realize you just have a random thought about, I'm really bored here, and whoop, it's a little jump. And then you're learning what works for you. It doesn't work forever. Usually what we do is the people would come for 4 visits. If they don't get it the first time, then we can give them some strategies. But it's amazing that it works. It usually takes 10-15 minutes before you find what works for you. And there's lots of research in this, and it looks like it works better if you don't give instructions, because then everybody can develop their own strategy. Because if you are priming people, if you're telling them what to try, then you're really reducing the scope of what they can do.
We've just got one in the chat here, Vincent. So it's from Christopher.
Yep.
What can primary school children do to learn more about how the brain works?
Well, I guess I'm not too sure what's being taught in primary school these days. There's probably a lot of experiments you could be doing. And what's great these days, because of the internet, there's probably a lot of experiments on the internet, psychology experiments that you can be playing as a class or even on your own to try to see how your brain works. And of course, you can, if you look at illusions or auditory illusions, then you can trick your brain, try to understand how your brain gets tricked by different sounds or different sights. So there's a lot you can do on the internet. So if you just look for psychology experiments online, you can find lots of games, I guess, to play that will then teach you something about your brain.
I don't know if can you see the other questions in the Zoom?
Yeah, I can go from Laurie, where when you started studying and looking into brains, did you find something that freaked you out? Well, to be honest, the first time I saw a real brain and watched a real brain, that really freaked me out. And I haven't done this much. That's why I quickly then went to brain images, looking at brain pictures than brains. So that really freaked me out. So always, we're looking at loads of different disease in the brain. We're looking at not just disease, of course. We're trying to understand how healthy brains are working and how the brain changes. As I said, you grow up or when you grow old, what starts to go wrong when you're old. So there's always something new to learn. And the more we know, the less we know. The more you try to answer one question, and then you have 10 new questions once you've answered it. So there's always things to do. On the chat, MRI scanner dangerous and does it create radiation? So no, so an MRI scanner is not dangerous. So there are some types of imaging machines which are not, and I wouldn't say dangerous, but which have radiations, for example, but not an MRI scanner. So it just works through a magnetic field. So it's all providing you don't have any metal in your body, and you would be fully checked before you go in the scanner. So if you have any metal in your body, we have NHS radiographers, so they go for an interview with you, and if there's any potential risk, you wouldn't go in the scanner, especially as a research participant. If you the hospital, then it's for the doctors to decide. But in our case, we don't have a choice. If you recommend or NHS radio, nope, you're not going to be scanned. I can't scan you. So the scan is not dangerous. I mean, MRI scanners have existed since the 80s, I guess, 1980s, and maybe lots of studies looking at long-term effects of the stuff. Because when you're coming for a scan, you're coming for maybe half an hour, but working there, they're there every day. Of course, they're not in the scanner room, but they're just outside of it. And there's been no proof of any risk directly linked to the MRI scanner itself. So another one in the chat. Is a brain like a big squiggly thing with inside, or is it one long string with neurons inside curled up? It's big squidgy. I think it looks a bit like jelly, like blancmange, as people say, rather than jelly. And there's loads and loads. I mean, neurons as there's loads of different types of brain cells, all crammed into your brain. And actually, because there's not much space in your head for the brain to grow, so the brain starts curling up. So you see all these folds and creases. It's just to make more brain surface, to fit in more brain inside your head, because clearly the bones are not going to move anymore. So the brain scrunches up to make more to be able to pack in more cells, basically.
Have we got any more on you? Sorry, Vincent. Have we got any more on YouTube, Jess?
I've got one here from Jerko. Have you used virtual reality to simulate a brain?
No, I know that some people are trying. I mean, you don't need virtual reality to simulate the brain. There's lots of different ways that the brain is. You mean to? Sorry, do you mean simulated or stimulated? Sorry, Jess.
Simulate. Sorry, simulate.
Yeah, to simulate. So simulate, as in to create a brain. There's people, even there's brains on chip now. I think it's IBM. There's lots of manufacturers of computer chips who are now created like brain. That's what they call their brain-like or their cognitive processing to make computer chips behave like neurons, connecting like neurons do in a brain. There's even ways now of actually growing neurons directly on the silicon of brain chip. Again, this is done already. It doesn't do much yet, but you can see this kind of potential merging of the wetware, as we call it, from the brain with the hardware. So all of this work is starting. But I guess maybe for the virtual reality, maybe the person who asked the question was talking about using virtual reality to stimulate the brain in some experiments. So yes, I mean, personally, I haven't done, but I certainly, it's certainly being done. So I was showing you an eye tracker earlier, in the supermarket, when you can see, we can track your eye movement. So to do this, we have some sort of goggles, and we can use this as well for virtual reality type scenarios. So the one I was showing you when you're moving in the landscape, this was some sort of basic virtual reality, immersive scenario when you're just in this landscape and you look at where you are. Of course, when you're in an MRI scanner, the big problem is you can't move. So you've got you're lying down. You've got some sort of helmet around you with lots of padding, because we don't want, because if you start moving your head, this creates loads of problems for us. So we, in terms of analyzing the data, and of course, because if your brain moves all the time, we don't know what we're looking at, where we're looking. So the idea is not to move. So any kind of virtual reality will involve just like moving with a joystick rather than just looking around. But it's certainly done. I know that the place we're at work at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience, a lot of my colleagues are using virtual reality with patients, for example, not in the scanner, but it's certainly doable. So a typical example in the scanner, I think in the past, would have been people who are afraid of spiders, arachnophobia. So you'd have some sort of virtual reality. And then the more afraid you are, so again, we go back to this loop of this neurofeedback, you could think the more afraid you are of the spider, the bigger the spiders, or the closer they would come to you. So you have to learn to relax for the spiders to go away, for example.
We've got a question from Susan. So what hobbies do you have away from work, and how do you de-stress?
That's a good question. Being an academic is quite a whole-encompassing job these days. You work, it's certainly not a 9-to-5 job, so it's important to be doing other things. Well, I've got my children somewhere upstairs, maybe watching now. So spending time with the children, spending time at home, reading a lot, not non-work related. It's good to just do something else. Yeah, I think just doing other things. I think it's good to just put the laptop away and do some non-related things as well.
We've got one here. So what is the biggest project that you've ever done?
I think I've answered this one earlier. Probably, I think the biggest project was probably like this kind of my own project was probably my PhD, which I took 6 years to do because I was doing it I was working full time and doing it part time on the side. So this was a big 6-year project. Most of the research projects we're involved in, I mean, when we have, for example, these clinical trials, we have sometimes like 5-year projects. So the entrepreneurship one is another 5-year project. But usually depends on the funding you get. Sometimes it's 1-2 years project. And sometimes if you're lucky, you get funding for 5 years. I've got some questions on Zoom. How long have scientists been studying the brain? Well, for a very long time. But interestingly, of course, if you go back to the Greeks, the ancient Greece and everything, people thought at that time that the brain was not really important. They thought the heart was really important, and that the brain was just a cooling system for the heart. But everything was in the heart. Your emotions, the center of your thinking was in your heart, not in your brain. So the brain as an organ for thinking came later. But really, I would say, I mean, people have already been interested in, because there's already examples of, in Egypt, for example, where people they found mummies and skulls with holes in them, where people have been trying already. The doctors understood that they did some sort of surgery in the brain. But really, if you think about Leonardo da Vinci and all these, Italian at the Renaissance, this is where people starting dissecting the brain and really trying to understand what the brain is. And of course, these days we have all these wonderful technology to help us study, not just because before it was really limited to study either, the dead brain. Of course, psychologists were trying to understand what the brain was doing from the outside by doing experiment and looking at your behavior and recording things from the outside. Now with the technology, we can actually look what's happening inside your brain as you're doing these experiments. And of course, technology is changing all the time. So we can do more and more all the time.
Have we got any on YouTube, Jess?
Yes, we have one. So, are any of the results from your studies used for the gaming industry, particularly knowing which part of the brain to stimulate during the game?
I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised because in a way the research is out there. All the research everybody does is published. So I wouldn't be surprised if the game industry was looking. But in a way, you don't need the brain. You don't need the neuroscience specific brain research to do that. A lot of the games, it's basic psychology. In a way, when you're developing your games, you're targeting emotions, you're targeting addiction, you're trying to get people, addicted to this little red dot on your screen to tell you that there's a new message, there's a new thing. You don't need the brain. This is just psychology in itself. It's not brain research, brain imaging. But certainly there's these days there's a new, I guess, generation of games. When you would have these neurofeedback, you can do games, you can buy these headsets. They're not like research grade headset, but you can buy some basic headsets to measure your brain waves, and then you use these in games, for example. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's certainly more and more of these in the coming years, because the equipment is getting better and cheaper all the time. So soon we will have proper research quality, I guess, gaming headsets that we could be using. There's a question, I'm just looking on Zoom, from BB McKinley around how many people's brain have you studied? Well, it's not just me, but I know because I asked recently, I can't remember the exact number, but we have a database at work that stores the data from all the people we've scanned, mostly just for research purposes. And I think there was about 100,000 people have been scanned in my bits of Kings. That's over the last probably 20 years, I would say, mostly for research purposes. So it's a lot. So we have several MRI scanners that are working, every day, including Sundays, I think now, but mostly for research purposes. So it's a mass production of research images. So we've scanned a lot of people.
We've got a question just popped up in the chat as well. So how soon do you think there will be a game available that you can just play at home with your brain?
Well, that already exists. There's even, I think the first one was something, there's a brand called Mattel, a brand of game. I think they did something years ago now. It's probably 6, 7, 8 years ago, which was some sort of Star Wars inspired thing when you had to do things with your brain. You had some balls and some air floating, and you had to direct it or direct the ball or something. So these things already exist. You can already do things like, I know that in my place of work in one of the buildings, when they do open days, you can place Calectrix, when you're driving the cars, on circuits. You can play this with your brain rather than with a controller. You can race somebody. So these things already exist.
As Jess, have you got any more from YouTube?
Maybe not.
I've got one here, but it's a good one. So I feel like we should get a couple of others out of the way first.
They're all good. They're all good.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just looking on Zoom. If you're a scientist or someone that knows more than the average human, do they normally have more neurons in their brain? Interesting. So I think the number of neurons is not the important thing. It's the connections between. I'm not saying we do, of course, but it's the connections between the neurons, which is really important. And funnily enough, moving away strategically from that question to something slightly related, if you look in animal brains, do you know that the human brain is not the most complex brain at all? If you were to look in animals, like if you take like dolphin brains, for example, they're in terms of the size of the brain compared to the body and the amount of wrinkliness in the brain, you know that dolphin brains, for example, are more complex than human brains. I guess we're lucky that dolphins are underwater, and we're lucky that they don't have any hands and they don't have any thumbs. So that's why we are here and not dolphins sitting on the chair talking to you today. But everybody, it's not because you have a big head that you have a bigger brain, that you're more intelligent or something like this. And of course, intelligence is something really fluid. You're always learning. Every time you learn something new, you are building new connections in your brain. This is how you remember. This is where you build your memories. This is why you have to repeat. If you're learning a new skill, you have to repeat it again and again until you really learn it, and until these connections form, these new connections form in your brain. I carry on with Zoom, if you don't mind. From one question from Darren: is it expensive to run an MRI scanner? I know that the cost that for us at King's College London, so it's a transparent cost, so everything has to be accounted for. It costs it's on average about £500 an hour to run a MRI scanner, and we can tell you, not now, but exactly where every pound is going in that. And to buy the equipment, not if you were to buy the scanner, it's about £1 million, £1.5 million. I mean, it's a bit like everything else. You can buy lots of different options, and you can buy the newest model, which would be more expensive. So you have to get the scanner, you have to build a room around, because it's not just a scanner. The room has to be shielded, and then there's the running costs. So for us, the London price, if you want, between King's, UCL, Imperial, I mean, if you had to charge, it's usually around 400, 500, 600 pounds and per hour. And then again, it depends on who you are. So charities would pay less, for example, than commercial partners like pharma companies. So it really depends, but it's in the hundreds of pounds an hour for sure. As MRI scanning stopped due to current circumstances, that's interesting. I know that for us, at least at King's, research scanning has stopped, but MRI scanners are being used clinically now to help diagnose or help with diagnostics, I guess, of COVID patients, I guess. But certainly we're not doing any physical research anymore that involves physical contacts. So most of the research, the lucky ones have moved their research online in the same way that your teaching has moved online. Any more questions?
I think one from Lola there.
Sorry.
Do you want to read that one?
Question from Lola Ray. I've looked at a lot of illusions where you look at a dot in the middle of the screen where the rest of the screen move around. When you do your research, do you have illusions for people as well? I've never studied illusions, but other people have, so I can't tell you too much about it, but we certainly always have something on the screen for people to look at. Even if it's just the most simplistic thing, would just be like a cross in the middle of the screen, just to keep people's attention, because we want people, when they're doing the experiment, we want them to be looking at the screen. We don't want them to be closing their eyes or just looking on the side of the scanner. We want them focused on the experiment. So when there's a break in the experiment, doing what we call the rest conditions, there usually be a cross or something really simple on the screen just to carry on paying attention. But I've never studied illusions myself.
What we'll do is we'll end on Jessie's question that she's got from YouTube.
Okay, so got a question here. What are the main differences between a child and an adult brain? And what is the last part of the brain to develop? And how does it affect someone's actions or life?
Oh, that's a big question. So there's a whole department at my work trying to understand exactly that question. But certainly, the brain carries on changing. So interestingly, when I was the age of the people listening today, people were saying that after 18, when you were reaching 18, 20 years old, that was it. your brain stopped growing. There was no new brain cell. It was just the way it was just down after this. Your brain cells were starting to deteriorate. Now we know that it's not true. We know that brain cells, you get new neurons, you develop new neurons all your life in a way, otherwise you wouldn't be able to learn and build new connections. But of course, when you're a child, your brain is an explosion of neurons, new neurons being created all the time. So the brain mature in different ways. It matures slowly. Certainly, the part that develops the last is the frontal part of the brain, which is the higher order thinking, if you want. Develops last in humans, and it does make sense. So that in a way, the developments follow evolution. First, you have all your basic needs. If you look, some of my colleagues have mapped brain development with basic developmental skills, and you can see that your brain matures first to make you be able to walk, and then to talk, and then to think, and then it's only at the end that the front of the brain really matures to make you start to think, in a complex way, critical way. But again, I'm not an evolutionist. I'm not a psychologist, so I can't really answer that in more details than that. Remember, I'm an engineer.
Thank you very much, Vincent. That's been fantastic. Some really, I think you'll agree, some amazing questions that have come through.
Yes, thank you very
from
much.
our young engineers. And I just want to thank you as well for your time today.
Thank you.
I think this has been a very different one, hasn't it, today, with you being at home?
Yeah, it was different. Usually we have schools
Yes.
looking at us and teachers asking questions. So there's one more question which arrived on Zoom. What is your favorite part of the brain? I don't have one. I don't have a specific. It depends on which bit you're working on at the time. I don't really have. I'm just looking at the brain. I don't really have a favorite part. No. I'm just looking at it. No, I don't have everything. Everything is interesting.
That's a really nice last question as well, isn't it? With it all being about the brain,
yes.
What is your favorite part of the brain as well? So thank you for everyone who has been participating today in the Zoom call and on YouTube as well, and asking all the questions. What I said at the start is that we'll do a little bit of kind of a what's next for all the participants to do at home. I'm just going to share my screen, and then Jess is just going to talk a little bit about what's happening next.
I'm staying on. I want to know what's happening next.
So. Yes, brilliant.
Hi everyone. So the reason we want to do this what's next section is just to provide a bit of context behind this interview. So why are we doing these? Well, we want to give you something fun to work on at home while we're in this situation. So what you can do now, if you haven't already, is to register for the Leaders Award competition. This can be done through our website. And here you will be able to download free resources to work through whilst you're at home. So once you've registered, log into the resources area, and you can start completing the tasks in the handbook and the engineer's logbook. We will be hosting our online interviews on Mondays and Wednesdays for the foreseeable. And once you can
Sorry, Jess. Can you see my screen there? Sorry.
Yes, it's just very big. Oh gosh, yes. It's very zoomed in.
Very big and blurry.
Oh right, let me just stop sharing. I'll try again with that. It's gone a bit strange, I think there. Let me just see if it'll happen again now. Sorry about that. Is that better?
Yes, we're good. Okay, so we'll be hosting these interviews on Mondays and Wednesdays for the foreseeable. You can join us for our next one. This is going to be this Wednesday at 10:30 with Elaine Meshke. Elaine is a senior consultant at a.k.a. Technology, looking at renewable energy and how to deal with that and go forward in the future. Like I say, you can tune into as many of these as you want. We want people to tune into them week upon week, as we have such a wide range of engineers wanting to be involved. So once you've sort of worked your way through the start of the resources, you'll start to get a bit of an idea about what the competition is. But in a nutshell, what we ask you to do is to identify a problem that affects you, your family, your neighbourhood, or the whole world. We then ask you to do a couple of different activities which will help you to find a solution to your problem. And then we want you to send that into us with a letter to persuade engineers to build your design. Now, this is going to happen in a roundabout way. So we have the activities, and what we ask you to do is repeat these steps weekly. So you're going to design a new solution each week. And then when it's time to go back to school, we want you to gather your family members, and we want you to try and pick out your best design and your favorite design. You're going to then take this into school and ask your teachers to submit your entry to us. So what happens then is all of your entries are graded by engineers, pass, merit or distinction. We then select our winners, and we select shortlisted entries to be put on at a public exhibition. All details of this will be provided to you when the time comes. Obviously, in the situation we're in at the moment, we just have to play it day by day. We do also have university teams on board. So we call these our proto teams, and they will pick certain designs to then make into a real life prototype. So it's a really, really great competition, really good thing to be involved in. And we want to ask you, if you were an engineer, what would you do?
Thank you very much for that, Jess. So like we just said then, Jess has explained kind of what's the next kind of steps and processes. Our next upcoming interview is Elaine Meshki, so please join us for that as well. Another big thank you to Vincent for coming on today. Thank you very much, Vincent.
Yes, thank you, Vincent.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you everyone for listening and asking questions.
Thank you. We'll leave it there. Bye everyone. Thank you very much.